Anne of Brittany, who died on the 9th of January 1514 at the age of 36, was in her lifetime one of the most powerful and influential women in Europe, and her lavish funeral both reflected her powerful political status and also where her heart and her priorities in life really lay. Anne was the eldest daughter of Duke Francis II, the ruling Duke of Brittany, and his second wife, Margaret de Foix. Duke Francis's mission in life, having inherited his duchy from his cousin, was to protect and maintain the autonomous status of his lands and their independence from the grasping French crown who were keen to absorb them. There was, however, one major problem in this plan. Although Duke Francis had married twice, he only had 2 daughters, and there were no male heirs to the duchy. And according to the Salic law that then prevailed in Brittany, only men could inherit his duchy, and he was unlikely now to have a male heir. He was keen that Anne, his eldest daughter, would inherit, and he made political arrangements for that eventuality. In 1486, when Anne was 9, he had the Estates of Brittany, the equivalent of the Parliament in England, overturn the Salic law and recognise Anne as his heir apparent. Suddenly, through this action, Anne became the greatest heiress in Europe, and she was quite a prize on the marriage market, and she became quite naturally the focus of the ambition of many princes in Europe, and her potential marriage was used to ally Brittany politically with other powers. Before her father's death, she was for a time betrothed to Edward, Prince of Wales, the son of Edward IV of England, one of the princes in the Tower. Then she was betrothed to Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII, and after that to the future Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian, and then to the future Louis XII of France. 2 of these men she would in time actually marry. Shortly before his death, Duke Francis was at war with King Charles VIII of France, and to ensure peace, he made an agreement with Charles that when he died, Anne could only marry a husband with the French king's consent. When Duke Francis died at the end of 1488, Anne, who was then only 11, did succeed him, but with that agreement in place. However, she ignored it, and in December 1490 she married by proxy at Rennes Cathedral one of her former suitors, the future Emperor Maximilian. Sadly, Charles VIII of France saw this as a declaration of war, and he invaded Brittany forthwith, laid siege to Rennes, a siege that he eventually won. When Charles entered Rennes, Anne, who was then only 14, was forced to sign a new treaty with Charles that included an arrangement for her marriage. After refusing the hand of a number of French nobles suggested by Charles, in despair, in November of 1491, Charles offered his own hand in marriage. She only agreed as the marriage contract would bring peace, and it's really dubious whether the marriage was at all legal. She had exchanged vows with Maximilian, and although unconsummated given her age, that marriage had not been annulled by the Pope. It would be some months before that annulment came through, but it did, and in February of 1492, Anne was crowned and anointed as Queen of France at the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis. The marriage between Anne and Charles VIII was not a particularly happy one, and by the time of his death in 1498, at the age of 27, there were no living children to inherit, although she had been pregnant at least 5 times. Their longest living son, Charles, Dauphin of France, this is his monument, dying of measles shortly after his 3rd birthday. This lack of heirs caused an inheritance crisis in France. But when Charles died, Anne, now 21 and a dowager queen, returned to Brittany and carried on ruling as sovereign duchess. However, she was a marriageable young widow, and the terms of the 1488 contract between her father and Charles VIII kicked in once again. In August of 1498, the new King of France, Louis XII, formerly the Duke of Orleans and a distant cousin of Charles VIII, offered Anne his hand in marriage. Now, again, there was a problem with that, for Louis was already married. He was married to Joan, the daughter of his predecessor Louis XI. But he said to Anne that he would try to arrange an annulment. Anne didn't think this would succeed, so she agreed, thinking she'd be left alone to rule her duchy. Louis and Joan had been married for over 20 years, but there were no children from the marriage. And Louis argued that their marriage was unlawful, as it had been made when she was under the canonical age to marry, she was 12, and that she couldn't therefore have consented, and that the marriage had not been consummated, as she had a physical deformity. Now, all these arguments worked a treat. The Pope granted the annulment. Joan very happily retreated to a convent. She's now a Catholic saint. Louis found himself a bachelor. And on the 7th of January 1499, Anne of Brittany unexpectedly found herself, for the second time, the Queen of France. This time, being older and wiser, she negotiated a marriage contract that recognised that she would remain the sovereign Duchess of Brittany. Brittany was not being absorbed into France, and that her second child, whether male or female, would inherit the duchy in due time, therefore keeping the duchy, as her father had wished, separate from the French throne. She would be pregnant many times over the next few years, but most of the pregnancies sadly led to stillbirths. 2 of her children survived to adulthood. Claude, who would inherit her lands as Duchess of Brittany and would in time become the Queen of France as the wife of Francis I, and Renée of France, who would marry the Duke of Ferrara. Anne and Louis seem to have had a reasonably happy married life in general. They lived primarily at the Château Royal de Blois, a palace inherited by Louis as Duke of Orleans, and which he lavishly rebuilt in the latest Renaissance fashion. It was there, on the 9th of January 1540, that Anne's short life came to an end. It is said that she died as a consequence of an acute kidney stone attack, though she may well have simply been exhausted as a consequence of years of being pregnant. Louis would himself die the year after his queen. At her death, Louis seems to have been genuinely heartbroken. He ordered the most lavish funeral ever seen on French soil, and then he withdrew from the court for nearly a week. The funeral obsequies for Anne were to last for a really extended period of time. She died on the 9th of January 1514, and her body, or most of her body, wasn't finally buried in Saint-Denis until the 16th of February. What is more, Louis ordered a very detailed account, written by the herald Pierre Choc, of every single element of the ceremonial of Anne's funeral, with illuminations showing different moments in the funeral ritual. Louis ordered that multiple copies be made of this and distributed to the royal families of Europe and prominent members of the French royal family and aristocracy. Even Henry VIII had a copy of it. So a very accurate description of the whole ceremony from beginning to end has come down to us, an illustrated account. And this detailed account of the funeral ritual of Anne of Brittany influenced all later French royal funerals and many elsewhere, including royal funerals in 16th and 17th century England. On the day of her death, Anne's entrails and heart were removed from her body. Her body was then dressed, and it was prepared for a private lying in state for her closest household members and servants. She died on Monday the 9th of January, and her body would remain lying on her deathbed until Saturday the 14th. And during this time, constant vigil was being kept and Mass was being celebrated in the adjoining oratory 3 times a day. On the 14th, her body was then moved to a larger room in the chateau called the Salle d'Honneur, which was richly hung with tapestries and where the wider court could then pay their respects to her. Her body in the Salle d'Honneur was placed on a canopied bed of state with a crown upon her head and 2 royal sceptres lying beside her, including the French hand of justice. Holy water vats and sprinklers were kept at the foot of the bed to sprinkle the corpse, and again constant vigil was made and masses were celebrated here too 3 times a day. Her body remained exposed in that place until Monday the 16th, a week after her death, when it was then placed in the coffin by the Queen's personal female servants. The French royal family were coffined in much the same way as the English. They were wrapped in waxed cloth, they were clapped in lead, and then placed in a wooden case, with the aim of preserving the corpse for the long obsequies that were to come. The following day, Tuesday the 17th, the coffin was moved to another space in the palace, the Salle de Deuil, the mourning chamber. This appears to have been in the grand chamber of the palace, a much more public space, and the body was now hidden from view. Within the Salle de Deuil, the coffin was placed inside a bed of state, so that the counterpane of the base of the bed covered the coffin completely so that it couldn't be seen. So what you would in essence see as you entered this chamber during this phase of the lying in state was an empty bed. On the bed were placed the symbols of majesty. On the cushion, the crown. On the bed itself, the sceptre and the hand of justice. And the coffined body of Anne remained there in this bed of state until the 3rd of February. Then on the 3rd, Anne's coffin was taken out of the chateau and accompanied by 400 poor men in black cloaks bearing flaming torches. The body was taken to the collegiate church of Saint-Sauveur within the precinct of the castle. The church was destroyed at the French Revolution. When it reached the church, the coffin was placed beneath a structure called a chapelle ardente, what the English in the same period called a hearse. As well as calling it a chapelle ardente, the French also used a Latin term for this structure, castrum doloris, a castle of sorrows. And this castle of sorrows was a vast canopy with 5 turrets surmounted by thousands upon thousands of candles. The coffin underneath the chapelle ardente was covered with a fine pall of cloth of gold, and on top of that were still the sceptre and the hand of justice. The offices of the dead were sung, and the next day, the 4th, a requiem mass was celebrated, and then the corpse began its journey to Paris. The funeral cortege to Paris was accompanied by a considerable retinue and still the 400 poor men with their torches. Along the way, it was a long and slow journey. The corpse had to rest overnight, and it rested overnight in local parish churches, underneath a temporary chapelle ardente made of wooden poles and velvet that was dismantled and journeyed with the cortege. Anne's cortege reached the outskirts of Paris and the church of the Prior of Notre-Dame des Champs on the 13th of February. This would be the final resting place before the body of Anne would then enter Paris and make its way to Saint-Denis for burial. On the afternoon of the 14th of February, a vast procession containing members of the religious orders, the clergy of the royal chapels, the parish clergy of Paris, the members of the civic authorities of Paris, the Parisian Company of Archers, representatives of the university and its chancellor, all accompanied the corpse of Queen Anne on its way. It was at this point that the way the Queen's body was presented changed. The coffin was borne by nobles, and the rich pall of cloth of gold covering it was held at the 4 corners by the 4 presidents of Parliament. On top of the coffin was placed an effigy of the Queen's likeness, just like those used in England. This had been made by Jean Perial, the king's painter. The effigy, which was probably of wood, was dressed in Anne's royal robes with a rich jewelled crown on its head and the sceptre and the hand of justice in her hands. Over the coffin, 4 noblemen carried a canopy, and when the cortege entered Paris, the canopy was given over to the sheriffs and the provost of the city. The canopy was not carried directly over the coffin, but slightly behind it, so that the effigy of the Queen could be easily seen by the gathered populace. The cortege reached the Cathedral of Notre-Dame, where it would rest overnight in an enormous chapelle ardente that had cost 100 livres and was 5 metres by 5 metres, had 8 pillars and 5 turrets, and stood 11 metres tall. 3,600 pounds of wax were burnt at the obsequies in Notre Dame alone, a colossal amount. The next day, the 15th, Anne's body was removed once again in procession through the medieval streets of Paris to the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis, where the body was once again placed in a chapelle ardente, which was not quite as splendid as that in Notre Dame, but still cost 60 livres. The following day, after a requiem mass, Anne of Brittany was buried in a vault in front of the high altar of Saint-Denis, and the following year, Louis, her husband, would be buried beside her, following an equally lavish funeral. The monument of Louis XII and Anne of Brittany was commissioned by Louis' successor, Francis I, and was not completed until 1531. Designed by the Just brothers, it is a complex monument. In the base of the monument, there is a representation of Louis and Anne's decaying corpses. They're surrounded by figures of the 12 apostles, and these in turn are flanked at the four corners by four figures of the cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude, the virtues that a king and queen should have. Above, on the top of the monument, are figures of Louis and Anne piously kneeling at prayer. Their bodies would remain in the vault under this monument until the French Revolution, when, with other members of the French royal family, their corpses were disinterred without ceremony and thrown into a common grave. So what then of Anne's heart, which was removed 5 weeks before she was interred in Saint-Denis? Anne had made provision in her will for a separate burial of her heart, not an uncommon thing in late medieval and early modern Europe. What is exceptional about Anne's heart burial is the vessel in which it was to be contained and the location of its burial. Anne's parents had been buried in the Carmelite Friary of Nantes in Brittany. The friary was a new foundation, founded by Anne's aunt, Françoise d'Amboise, the wife of Peter II, Duke of Brittany. Anne's father, Duke Francis, had wanted to be buried there, as his first wife, Margaret, had also been buried there. Anne of Brittany commissioned the tomb herself that covers the grave of her father, mother, and his first wife in 1507, and that tomb is now in Nantes Cathedral. There are effigies on the top of it of her parents, and like her own tomb in Saint-Denis, these are surrounded by figures of the four cardinal virtues. The monument, we know, was carved by Michel Colomb and was designed by Jean Periel, who had designed the funeral effigy that went atop Anne's coffin. And Anne willed that her heart be buried within this tomb to her parents. To contain her heart, she commissioned an exquisite heart-shaped casket of gold, topped to the crown. I'm sure she commissioned it in her lifetime as part of the provision of her parents' monument. It may well have been designed by Periel too. This heart casket is hinged to open, and inside it is coated with white enamel with an inscription around the interior. The internal inscription was repeated on the outside in black enamelled letters. It reads, "In this little vessel of fine, pure and earthly gold rest a greater heart that any lady had in all the world." Anne was the name of her, in France twice queen, Duchess of the Bretons, royal and sovereign. The heart of Anne, Duchess of Brittany and Queen of France in this casket was treated in much the same way as the rest of her body. When it arrived at the Carmelite church in Nantes, it was placed in a chapelle ardente, covered in candles, while funeral obsequies and requiem masses were celebrated around it. Then it was placed within the tomb of her parents, so a little part of Anne was returned to her own beloved Brittany, where her metaphorical heart always was. Sadly, it was not to remain there. In 1792, during the French Revolution, when the Carmelite house at Nantes was levelled, the heart casket was found and the contents emptied. Remarkably, the casket survived. It was initially taken to Paris to be melted down, but miraculously it was saved, It was perhaps too unusual and exquisite an object to destroy. Preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale, it was returned to Nantes in 1819 and has been in a museum collection ever since. In 2018 it was stolen, but miraculously once again it was found and recovered. If you enjoy this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.